Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicholas Lynch. I'm a consultant working with the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on collaboration communicating. It's my pleasure to introduce Alan Hester. Alan is a leadership and management trainer with his management consultancy, Alan Hester Associates Limited. He delivers training, coaching, and consultancy to help companies meet a wide range of business and people challenges. He's also a director of an accredited centre delivering a range of institute and leadership management programs. As an author, he's written the book Management Starts With You, and his latest book, Get Out of Your Own Way, will be published in a few weeks. So, Alan, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thanks very much, Nicholas, and good afternoon, everybody. So today's topic is communication, which is part of the collaboration element of ILM's dimensions of leadership. So those dimensions of leadership are vision, creating a vision, are managing for achievement, creating a sense of ownership, and collaboration, along with authenticity, which clearly is a major issue for any of those things. So today we're talking collaboration. Why? My question would be, to start this off, what sets a manager apart from somebody in a personal performance role? And the definition that I tend to use is that as a manager or a leader, we're there to get things done, as everybody is, but we're there to get things done through others. And the way that we do that is by creating an environment that enables our team to perform. So all the aspects are important in successfully creating that environment, but I would suggest none more so than the topic of today's webinar, which is communication. Everything, if you think about it, is about communication. And if we start by this statement, that a collaborative leader recognizes the importance of formal and informal communication. In my view, you cannot manage without managing the twin pillars of both people and process, and you can't succeed by being brilliant at one and useless at the other one. Communication itself is also about people and process. More on that in a moment. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to be covering both formal and informal communication. We're going to be covering language and non-verbal communication, and also there will be a section towards the end on presentation skills. So this quote from Forbes Coaches Council reinforces that no matter what role, industry or career you're in, strong communication is going to be a key requirement. They identify clearly stating directions, giving information and messages in a way others can understand and follow, and that it's critical to achievement as a manager. So if we begin with this model, it's not a new model, but it's worth us going through. The model posits that communication is a two-way process, and that's something I think we can quite easily forget in our rush to get our message across to other people. So the model suggests there is a sender, so yourself. You send your message through whatever medium you decide to send it, and it's received by the other person before they then respond. But a number of things happen within that little exchange. The first thing is, when we give out information, when we talk to somebody else, we actually, that is described as encoding. So we deliver that in our own way. It's also received by the other individual in their own way as well. A model I often talk about with communication is that of an iceberg. What do we know about icebergs? We know that we see probably the top 1/7 of it, and the bulk of the iceberg is below the surface. It's a pretty good metaphor for human beings. What we see is the behavior, but what we don't see, at least immediately, is what is below the surface that gives rise to that behavior. So that's true of us, and it's equally true of the person that we're talking to. And a lot of this is subconscious, and you'll know when you are talking to other people that sometimes you will hit it off with them or get certain people. Others will put your backs up. Why? It's likely to be because we are subconsciously prejudging what the other person may be saying. So maybe we've dealt with a particular type of individual in the past. If somebody we're talking to reminds us of that certain type of individual, then we could be on the defensive. And research has shown we can actually hear different words that are said to us than are actually being said, just as we can see things differently from somebody else looking at the same incident. So communication is a process. There's a lot going on, and like all processes, it needs to be managed. It doesn't just happen. So I think a key for communication is that we need to be aware of the fact that there's a lot going on below the surface, and that means we need to be emotionally intelligent communicators and work on our communication in a conscious way. We will, as we said in the introduction, be communicating with people all the time, formally or informally. Really, I think communication, being a process, doesn't it deserve a little preparation time? So here are a few useful questions that we can ask ourselves, not in every case, not in some kind of mechanical way, but we do need to think about, for example, why am I communicating? A little exercise I do often with management and leadership groups is to ask them what are their main reasons for communicating with their teams. Very often, the first half a dozen reasons they give are all what I call me to you reasons. So it's to get something done, it's to follow up, it's to check on performance. And often we probably need to do a little more listening before we actually come and say our piece. So an important part of that is listening to ourselves. Why do I need to communicate? What's the purpose and what outcome do I need? Otherwise, there's a risk that we start the communication off, we're a little bit undercooked, and it goes wrong. We don't quite know why. What do we need to communicate? What is the content? And who do I communicate with, the type of language, and so on. It's also interesting that we often communicate when it's already urgent. So often we might say, is it urgent? Yes. Actually, was it always urgent? Probably not if we'd managed to communicate effectively beforehand. So communication isn't a one-off. People experience each communication in the context of their previous relationship with you, of previous communications, especially the most recent. And therefore, that's why, as we'll see a little bit later, it's difficult to betray somebody's trust and then go and seek some more. So for example, you can't ignore somebody and then ask them for their undivided attention, because it's not really going to work. So just going through some of these questions is going to help you to know, for example, do I need to see this person one-to-one? Do I need to book some time out to see them so that we're not disturbed? Or is it okay to just come up to them informally and say something? Here's a useful little list, the 7 C's of effective communication. Won't read them all out. What strikes me in looking at these is these are all, they're very much about how you come across to the person or people that you're dealing with. I would add a further 2 to that list. And I would say that we need, as well as these 7, to be confident, and we need to be consistent. I say confident because not that we want to be arrogant or to always feel that we're right, but if we are leading other people, then the people who are working for us, working with us, being led by us, will need to believe that we know what we're doing. I think that's an important thing. So we come across confidently. Nobody's going to be really inspired or reassured or feel secure with somebody who doesn't really seem to know what it is that they're saying, why they're saying it. And consistency, I think, is vital. One of my pet hates has always been at work if one day you come in and you make a light-hearted comment and it's funny, and the next day exactly the same kind of comment is made and somebody's mortally offended, or the type of manager where people say, oh, don't talk to her today, she's in one of those moods. I don't think we can afford to do that. So all these C's, I think, come under the umbrella of a word starting with P, which is professional. So we must be professional communicators. There's been a study done and repeated a number of times, which we're going to look at in a moment, about the difference in impact when you're communicating between the words that we use, between the tone of voice in which we say them, and our body language. Quote here, which identifies pretty much which of these is the most powerful, that says it's the non-verbal cues that we pick up from other people that are the most powerful and deliver more information about the intention of the speaker than the words that they use. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So when I first came across this many years ago, with my love of words as a trainer and as a writer, I was pretty disappointed that words only account for 7% of communication. Astonishingly low figure. 38% is the tone of voice we use when we're saying those words, and over half, well over half, is body language. There are cultural differences, but it's pretty widespread that certainly in Western cultures, if there is no eye contact, there is really no communication. People like to feel important. They like to be listened to. And the reason they want to be listened to is because they are experiencing everything through their own prism. They would expect somebody else to respect that. They also want to feel understood. And it's very difficult for somebody to feel listened to and understood if you don't appear to be engaging with them. I don't propose to go into body language in a big way, but it is well known that the more open our signals are, the better engagement we're likely to have. So the interesting thing, I think, for us as managers is, firstly, why are these percentages as they are? And secondly, what do we need to do about that? So why is body language the most important factor? I would say it's because we've, as a race, as humans, we've been doing it much longer. We are actually, all of us, experts in interpreting other people's body language. And the second reason is it's the first thing we see. Research has shown that, for example, in a job interview, the interviewer has made up their mind about the interviewee in something like 6 to 8 seconds. Before they said a word, purely their bearing, the way they approach them, shake somebody's hand, sit down. You can reverse that, but it takes an awful lot of work to reverse it. So is the 7%, are the words unimportant? Of course not. What this tells us is that when people are hearing the words that we say, they are interpreting those words through the medium of, firstly, body language, and secondly, tone of voice. So for example, in a meeting, you could be saying to one of your team, "Thanks, Carol, that's an interesting point." What impression would you get? Would she really think you found it interesting? Or you could say, "Thanks, Carol, that's an interesting point." And just think, what does the same 6 words said in that way suggest? Or we could say, "Thanks, Carol, that's a really interesting point." So the 3 ways of using the same words, very different meanings. So for us, I think, in trying to get the best out of other people, trying to create that environment that enables people to perform at their best, we need to be what a psychologist would call congruent. This means we mean what we say and we say what we mean. So whatever we're saying, we believe it, we're sincere, we're honest. Because if we're not, if there is some kind of disjoint between what we do, how we behave, and what we say, people will believe the evidence of their eyes more than the evidence of their ears. So if you want to sound interested, if you want to be interested, look interested, sound interested. Don't do, as I've heard people say before in very senior positions in big meetings, things like, "My door is always open, come through whenever you want to." because you're not going to. But my door is always open. I want you to come through whenever you want to. Is very different. So before we leave that, just a little bit on words themselves. As we've heard, the words are experienced within the context of the non-verbal. It's also possible, as I've done before on several occasions, I've paid good money to go and listen to somebody talk who I really admire and I'm really interested in, and I found myself scoring a hat trick at Wembley a few minutes into their presentation. And this is because we cannot simply sit and listen without having our attention also directed elsewhere. So that's something to bear in mind. But what I would suggest is language is clearly very important. It's infectious. Language is infectious. So we need to be careful what we say, because that is what other people will catch. Just as an example of that, I once introduced quite an unusual word in a business context in an organization I worked in. I dropped in the word emasculated just into a conversation with a couple of other managers. And within a week, 3 different people used the word emasculated. So isn't that interesting? So in summary, on communicating with people, then I think it's important to be authentic, which is one of the 5 dimensions of leadership. Anyway, it's important to be clear, but it's also very important to listen and to actually seek to understand before being understood, which is one of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And we'll come on to Stephen Covey in another form in a moment. So let's move on to another aspect of communication. Many managers are called on to do this. Not many like it, at least to begin with. But if you're going to be doing one to several, or even one to many, or even simply presenting to your team meeting, it's a pretty important skill for us to master. So what this little 4-step model here is suggesting, I think, is a very sensible approach to it, a very clear structure. So firstly, identify why you're giving the talk. Get to know as much as you can about who you are giving the talk to. Be prepared before you go in with what the key messages are that you're going to want people to go away with, and outline the scope. It's really interesting thing I've found on more than one occasion, the worst being somebody who was incredibly nervous, who was supposed to give a 5-minute presentation, who ended up talking for 30 minutes because he didn't have a structure, he didn't really know when to stop, and in the end had to be stopped. And this was a guy that actually beforehand didn't want to get up and give a talk at all. So, giving a talk. As Fassbinder says here, how you open and close your presentation decides everything. Nothing matters more for effectiveness. I would suggest a good structure is based on the advice that trainee journalists are often given before writing an article, and it's a 3-step thing. Say what you're going to say it, and say you said it. Repetition never hurts. People learn in very different ways. So just as when we're communicating with colleagues in the workplace, we need to be careful not to simply communicate in the way that suits us best, but to take account of their learning styles and needs. That's just as important in giving a presentation. And in fact, managers have said to me before, when complaining about a colleague of theirs, do you know, I've told this person 7 times and they still don't get it. And my response to that is, have you told them 7 times in the same way? If you have, you can tell them 17 times in the same way and they still won't get it. So we need to be aware that other people experience things differently to us. So it's a pretty neat structure to say today's talk is going to be about this, then deliver it, and then summarize what you said, because people will hear different things. I often see when I'm working with people, different people write notes at different points. So maybe in response to a quote, it may be in response to a fact, and so on. So beginning the presentation, grabbing the audience's attention, some things we can do are we can drop in a really unusual fact, a statistic, something that really surprises and shocks people. We could put in a quote that we think sums something up really neatly. We could tell a story, and humans love stories. So telling a story can be a really effective way of getting somebody engaged, or we can ask them a question. So in terms of delivering the presentation, just talk briefly through these steps here. The first one, and I think the most important of all, is the one at the top of the screen, practice. And while practice may not necessarily make us perfect straight away, if we don't practice, we're not going to be anywhere near as good as we could have been. So practice. I remember giving a talk to some 200 odd people in a university hall, and came off the stage at the end having coffee, and somebody came up to me and said, "Don't you ever get nervous making a presentation to that number of people?" And my honest answer was, no, unless I'm not prepared. If I don't feel I'm prepared, then I'm nervous, because how do I know the answers to questions people might ask? How do I know what I'm going to say? How do I know how long it's going to last? who am I talking to, and all those things. So if you've prepared and you've practiced as much as you can, then you've given yourself the best possible chance, and that's going to reduce your nerves. Secondly, assert yourself. So I'm going to say something which might sound a little bit counterintuitive here, and that is, you're not as important as you think you are. Nobody really in the audience is interested in you, they're interested in themselves. So they're there for their own reasons, not to comment on your clothes or your voice or whether you said or are. Third thing, make contact. Simplest way to do that, ask a question. Anyone here ever had to work with a difficult person? You'll get some hands raised. Anybody here who runs their business, runs their own business? If you've done your homework, you'll already know, of course, that they do. But crucially, they know then you will be relevant to them. Use your voice, overact. Look and sound interested, vary your pitch and tone. And also here, I would say, be yourself. Don't try and be somebody you're not, as you won't do that half as well as if you try to be the best version of you that you can. Breathe, always a good idea. What I take this to mean is take your time. And if you take your time, you're also then giving your audience time to take in the points that you're making. And drink water. Really what that's saying is look after yourself. As the airlines say, put on your oxygen mask first before you help other people. So a few final thoughts. So two very good quotes here. If I take the Covey, trust is the glue of life. If you've not read his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, it's still a great book after 20 years. And there's a couple of habits in there that I really like. One of them I've mentioned, which is seek first to understand before you seek to be understood, because most of us are so keen to get our message across that we actually don't stop and think about how it might be received. And what I'd say there is the advice my old science teacher gave me at school: you've 2 ears and 1 mouth, boy, use them in that proportion. Or a great George Bernard Shaw quote, listen or your tongue will make you deaf. People are influenced by what's important to them, not what is important to you. And the other Covey thing I like is the emotional bank account, which simply says our interactions with other people are like a bank account. We make deposits, we make withdrawals. The easiest way to make a withdrawal is to say you'll do something and then not do it. So, and the second quote, the single biggest problem is the illusion that it's taken place. Just a few very quick points on this before we move on to questions. Simply saying something is not the same as communicating. So listen to what the other person says and respond to it. Don't simply take turns at speaking. A lot of us do that, and it's not listening. Also fundamental, check that the other person has understood you. If it's important that you're understood, don't just deliver your statement and assume it's been understood. Check. Ask them to repeat it to you. Ask them if they have any questions. Just make sure that they're not just sort of sitting there passively. If they haven't understood, vary your method. People learn in all kinds of ways. As I said, they may be visual, they may be auditory, they may be kinesthetic. So if they're kinesthetic, for example, why not give them the opportunity to try out what you said? So I hope that's been useful for you. It's the most critical skill in management, in human relationships, in actually getting on with anybody and getting anything done. So hand back to you, Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alan. We got a couple of questions. You talked a lot about body language and eye contact and so on.
Yeah.
What about colleagues who find that difficult to pick up? And somebody said here, I'm thinking here about neurodiversity, people on the autistic spectrum who may not, be as well versed in picking up those sorts of communication styles, or may have different communication styles themselves and the way that they receive messages from colleagues.
Yeah, really good point and good question. If you're talking one-to-one with somebody who has issues with interpreting non-verbals, then it's another learning style in a way. It's another thing we have to adjust how we communicate with that person to make sure that they understand, they get it. So don't want to generalize, but typically with people that I've worked with who are on the Asperger's or spectrum or have a degree of autism, is clarity is very important, and so is consistency. So I don't think it's not as if we have to communicate with somebody in a very totally different way. It might be that we actually dial some of the content up and others down. So very direct, very straightforward, not forcing them to communicate in a way that's uncomfortable for them. So we need to find a level with everybody and relate to that. And the important thing is, whatever you need to achieve, or whatever the person you're communicating with needs to achieve, we find the best way to get that.
Yeah. I mean, following on from that, someone else has said, we have so much remote working now. We have remote teams and virtual teams, and a lot of what you've said about, eye contact and body language. Well, it might just be on the phone. Yeah, we might not see that. We might be communicating over other virtual methods. I mean, how does what you've said fit in with this, where more of us are working remotely and there's more virtual teams?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we do lose something by that kind of communication. So we're going to have to make sure that we make up for that. So if we have remote teams, then I think rather than simply relying on technology, we actually make the time to phone people. Where it's feasible, we go and see them. But even if we take the phone, bearing in mind that 55% of communication is body language, you don't get that on the phone. But interestingly, anyone who's been involved in sales training, for example, will know sales people on the phone are taught to sit up straight and to smile. Often people walk about. You try giving directions to somebody on the phone without waving your arms about. You can't do it. And I always remember a long time ago, I did some training for some long-term unemployed young people. And as part of the contract, we had to follow up with people who didn't attend. And I remember phoning this lad at the coffee break, and he said, oh yeah, he said, I'm in London at my grandmother's funeral. And I said to him, actually, you're in bed, aren't you? How did you know that? And it's because our body language and posture comes across in our tone of voice. So he couldn't feasibly sound like he was standing up doing something else when he was lying in bed, because there's not the oxygen in the lungs to do that.
So you can still pick up those those non-verbal signals, if that's the right sort of way of expressing it, even if you can't see them.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Otherwise, really, it's that whole 55-38-7 model isn't of that much value to us, because a lot of the time we're as the caller said, we're not with the person.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thanks to everyone who submitted the question, and sorry we didn't get to them all. Alan, thank you for taking us through that presentation and sharing your thoughts and experience with us. With that, I'm going to close the webinar and wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you.